People keep saying China is imperialist, and you probably heard it from US politicians, from magazines like the National Interest, and even from writers who call themselves Marxists. Tharappel wrote a paper arguing something surprising. China actually does fit an old definition of imperialism written by Vladimir Lenin over 100 years ago. But that definition turns out was broken from the start. And once we fix it, China ceases to look like an imperialist power at all. Its overseas investments might actually be doing the opposite of what old empires did. Apparently, in our modern age, whoever gets to define imperialism gets to decide who counts as a villain in the story of the modern world economy. And that story is currently being used to justify a lot of aggressive US foreign policy toward China. So it's worth getting the definition right. To understand all of this, we need to go back to two men writing about an empire right before World War I. In 1917, Lenin wrote a famous pamphlet called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and his goal was very political. He wanted workers across Europe to stop fighting World War I and start a revolution instead. His argument went like this: capitalism used to run on simple trade, that is, selling goods to other countries. But by the late 1800s, banks had merged with big industry, creating what Lenin called finance capital, or in other words, the money used for financialization. Remember this term, it's important. This new finance capital didn't just want to sell goods abroad anymore. It wanted to invest money abroad to chase higher profits in poorer countries where land, labor, and materials were cheap. That very hunger for overseas investment, Lenin said, was the real force pushing European empires into war over colonies. From here, Tharappel notices what's missing. Lenin never explains how rich countries physically pulled wealth out of poor ones. He described competition between empires, but not the actual mechanics of robbery, and that gap turns out to be a huge problem. Lenin basically built his theory on top of a British writer named John Hobson, who published a book called Imperialism, a Study, in 1902. Hobson believed British rule was mostly good for India, and this can be mainly credited to the building of railroads and schools, spreading Christianity, and so on. He said this because he knew some people accused Britain of draining wealth out of India, but he waved those claims away, saying the evidence was too shaky. The problem is, 1 year before Hobson's book came out, an Indian economist named Dadabhai Naoroji had already published detailed research proving the opposite. Britain really was draining India systematically for well over a century. Here's how the drain worked. Britain collected taxes from the Indian population, then used about a third of that tax money to buy Indian goods for itself. It also seized India's export earnings. Indians were left with less and less money circulating in their own economy, so they had to borrow back their own wealth from Britain with interest attached. To put it simply, India's own wealth got shipped out of the country, and then some of it was lent back to India as loans that Indians then had to repay with interest. So the same money left India, came back with a price tag attached, then left again. Decades later, economist Utsa Patnaik built on Naoroji's research and estimated the total drain at roughly $44.6 trillion in today's money, spread across 1765 to 1938. Those numbers are in trillions, not billions. The same period overlapped with some of the worst famines in Indian history, killing tens of millions of people, and most historians tie those famines directly to British policy, the same policies that helped fund Britain's Industrial Revolution. This is exactly the mechanism Lenin's theory missed. Hobson denied the drain existed, so Lenin never built it into his model of imperialism at all. Naroji pointed out something else Lenin missed. Not all colonies were treated the same way. Places like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were settler colonies. Britain actually sent capital there to help build up local industry because these were treated almost like extensions of Britain itself. India was the opposite. It was a colony for plunder. It wasn't invested in, rather, it was taxed and robbed. When you actually look at where the British capital went, over 80% of it flowed to Europe and the settler colonies, not to places like India. The issue with Lenin is that he lumped all these destinations together under the general term colonies, which hid the real distinction between investment and robbery. And from here, Tharappel establishes that Naroji was right, Hobson was wrong, and Lenin inherited Hobson's mistake. So how do we fix this? Tharappel suggests separating two ideas that constantly gets mixed together. These were class exploitation and national exploitation. Class exploitation is the classic Marxist idea pertaining to the capitalists exploiting workers inside one economy using one currency. National exploitation is different. It's one country draining wealth from another country through conquest, taxation, and control of currency. Now, to understand national exploitation, you have to understand something about money itself. Money isn't just a tool for trading goods, it's also a way to store value over time. In a world with many countries and many currencies, some currencies become more trusted stores of value than others. The country whose currency the whole world uses and trusts becomes what Tharappel calls the currency hegemon. Historically, that role belonged to Britain. Today, it belongs to the United States. Being the hegemon comes with a strange trade-off. The hegemon has to run trade deficits, buying more from the rest of the world than it sells because that's how its currency spreads around the globe. Meanwhile, rising economies or mercantile rivals, as Tharappel puts it, grow wealthy and industrialized by selling into the hegemon's market. Britain played as the hegemon to rising rivals like the United States and Germany before World War I. The US has played the same role since World War II, first against Germany and Japan, and now against China. Tharappel calls this the hegemon rival dynamic, and it explains a lot of today's tension without needing to prove that China is secretly plundering anyone. The idea builds on something else too, which is the core periphery model made famous by the sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein. In that model, rich core countries produce high-value goods, while poorer periphery countries mostly supply raw materials and cheap labor. It's a useful snapshot, but after all, it's just a snapshot. It doesn't explain how countries move between categories over time. By adding Tharappel's hegemon rival idea, the picture of the argument becomes more reliable. It shows how a periphery country can industrialize its way into becoming a new core country, and even a new hegemon without ever needing to conquer anyone. That matters a lot for the post-colonial world. After World War II, European empires lost their colonies, and old-style plunder became much harder to pull off. The US briefly kept a gold-backed dollar, but without a captive colonial periphery to lean on, the way Britain had India. The system only lasted 27 years before collapsing in 1971. Some economists argue this collapse actually marked a real weakening of imperialism, since newly independent countries no longer had wealth forcibly extracted from them, the way India once did. Later in the 1970s and 80s, neoliberal policy, things like demands for privatization and open capital markets, clawed some of that leverage back, but it never fully returned to the old colonial model of direct plunder. Now we can actually answer the question fairly. Is China's overseas investments, things like the Belt and Road Initiative and its infrastructure loans across Africa and Asia, a form of imperialism? Using Lenin's original narrow definition, sure, technically, China exports capital. So by Lenin's rules, that makes China imperialist. Some writers have made exactly this argument. But using the corrected definition, imperialism as a national exploitation, our answer changes completely. China isn't taxing African countries and shipping the proceeds home. It isn't running colonial governments there. It has almost no military presence in Africa at all. Instead, Chinese capital is funding actual infrastructure, railways, ports, power plants, the same pattern British capital once used to build up the US, Canada, and Australia. Sub-Saharan Africa has become one of the fastest growing regions on Earth, largely riding on Chinese investments, while American and European investments there had been shrinking. In other words, Chinese capital exports look a lot more like the settler colony pattern of investment than the colony for plunder pattern of extraction. That's the exact distinction Lenin's original theory was never able to see. If China isn't practicing old-school imperialism, why does the US keep describing it as an aggressive, dangerous rival? Because this isn't really an imperialist conflict. It's a hegemon rival conflict. The US built its post-war dominance the same way Britain once did, as the country whose currency the world trusted most. But holding that position means constantly running trade deficits, and China has become the world's largest net exporter of both capital and goods, meaning the balance keeps shifting in China's favor. American manufacturing has shrunk over the decades. The US has been a net debtor since the 1980s, relying heavily on foreign money, especially Chinese money, to keep its economy running. And that's the real anxiety inside Washington. Not that China is stealing from other countries, but that China's rise threatens the dollar's central role in the world economy. This is an old familiar pattern. It's basically what happened when the United States overtook Britain a century ago. Nobody called America's rise imperialism back then. It was simply history's most powerful currency finally losing its grip. None of this means China is some perfectly innocent actor with zero self-interest. Of course, it's acting in its own interest, like every state does. But there's a real difference between competing for economic advantage and actually draining another nation's wealth through conquest and forced taxation, the way Britain drained India for roughly 2 centuries. According to Tharappel, calling China imperialist by using Lenin's old, incomplete definition doesn't just get the history wrong, it also does real political work today. It helps justify aggressive US policy towards China, dressed up in anti-imperialist language that Lenin originally built to oppose exactly that kind of warmongering. If we actually want to oppose imperialism, real imperialism, the kind that starves tens of millions of people and drains trillions of dollars out of colonized nations, we need a definition solid enough to survive contact with the real world. Nauroji had that definition over 100 years ago. It's time the rest of us caught up with him. That doesn't mean every question about China's rise is settled. Whether China ever becomes a currency hegemon itself, and what it might do with that power if it does, is still an open question. But answering that question honestly requires the right tools, and Lenin's borrowed, Hobson-shaped definition of imperialism was never built to handle it. If you want to see more videos like this, please like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts down below. This is Polity. Let's get to work.